About 10 years ago, a new neighbor moved into the house across the street in my old neighborhood. She was a woman in her mid-40s who lived alone and kept mostly to herself. While she was polite when greeted, smiling and responding kindly, she never seemed interested in forming friendships. She rarely left her home, and when she did, it was usually for a brief walk or to check her mail. Although she came across as friendly, her behavior seemed a bit unusual. Typically, I would be outside playing with my friends in the front yard, running around while she sat on her patio and watched us for hours without making any effort to conceal it. Occasionally, we'd catch her just sitting there, staring at us with a blank expression. When she wasn't on the patio, we would notice her peeking through her curtains, as if she was constantly keeping an eye on what we were doing, even when we were inside the house. One night, while my parents and I were watching TV in the den, we noticed the lights in front of our house flicker on and saw a shadow moving outside. Someone seemed to be out there, but their face wasn't clearly visible. My dad got up to investigate, but by the time he reached the front door, the person was gone. After a quick look around, he didn't find anything unusual, so we dismissed it as nothing and went to bed. The next morning, as my dad was leaving for work, he noticed something odd. The solar panel lights that were stuck in our lawn by the driveway were missing. The disturbed soil showed where they had been pulled out. As he backed out of the driveway, he glanced over at the neighbor's yard and saw all 5 of our solar lights lined up exactly the way we had them in our yard. Amused, he woke my mom and me to come see. Sure enough, the lights were now in her yard. However, we decided not to confront her, since the lights weren't expensive, and we didn't like to make a fuss. That morning, the neighbor was outside, acting completely normal, watering her flowers. We exchanged awkward glances but chose to let it go. After that incident, we began to notice other strange things happening. Our holiday decorations, both Halloween and Christmas, would often get damaged or go missing each year, something that didn't seem to happen to any of our other neighbors. One Halloween, our carved pumpkins vanished the night before the holiday. Eventually, we stopped decorating to avoid further problems. It also became clear that the neighbor copied almost everything we did. If we arranged our garden in a certain way, she would do the same. If we got a new garden gnome, she'd have one the next day. If my mom wore a sun hat, she'd be wearing one too. Even when we raked leaves, she'd come out and rake at the same time. Still, we never confronted her or treated her differently because she didn't seem like a real threat. Over the years we lived there, she did many other odd things, but none worth dwelling on. We eventually moved away, and fortunately, our current neighbor is kind and respectful. About 4 years ago, I was living alone as a single mom in a house just outside of town. It wasn't too far from the main part of town, but it wasn't close enough to walk there either. I had a few neighbors nearby, and we would occasionally see each other, as most people in the area knew one another. However, one night something happened that I'll never forget. I was up late cleaning the house after putting my son to bed. I let my dog, Goldie, out to play in the large field next to my house, where she loved to run around. As I washed dishes, I hummed along to the music playing on the radio. It was a quiet evening, and I was focused on tidying up before heading to bed. When it was time for Goldie to come in, I stepped outside to call her back. She often wandered to the far end of the field, so I wasn't worried when I had to call her a few times. While I was calling for her, I noticed something strange, a small light flickering in the field, like someone was using a flashlight. I immediately felt uneasy and stayed near the lights on my property, knowing my neighbor across the street could see me if anything happened, which gave me a little comfort. I called for Goldie again, louder this time, not wanting to venture into the dark field to find her. As I waited, I listened for the sound of her paws, but instead, I heard a faint male voice coming from the direction of the light, also calling my dog. I didn't recognize the voice, and when I looked, I saw Goldie standing halfway between me and the light, unsure whether to come to me or go toward the stranger. My fear spiked, but I wasn't going to let anything happen to Goldie. I shouted her name with all my strength, and thankfully, she wagged her tail and ran straight to me. As soon as she reached me, I grabbed her and rushed back into the house, locking the door behind us. Inside, I turned off all the lights so I could see out without being seen. My heart was racing, but I stayed calm, grabbing my baseball bat just in case. I double-checked that all the doors and windows were locked before taking a quick peek outside. The light in the field had disappeared. About 10 minutes later, I turned on a small kitchen light to finish the dishes, but I kept the bat nearby, still on edge. After about half an hour, I was starting to relax. Just as I was drying my hands, a loud crash echoed from the garage. Startled, I quickly called my neighbor across the street, asking him to look outside and see if anyone was near my garage. I explained that I was about to turn on the garage lights and open the door remotely from inside the house. He agreed to help but sounded concerned. I quietly went to the laundry room, which leads into the garage, and pressed the button to open the garage door. As the light flickered on, my neighbor suddenly panicked, shouting that there was a man in the garage. Fear surged through me as I glanced around the garage from inside the laundry room, bat in hand. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, and cautiously approached the area near my car. I raised my voice and firmly said, "I know you're over there. You're trespassing, and if you don't leave, I'll call the police." The man, surprisingly, stood up casually as if nothing was wrong, apologized, and walked out of my garage, claiming he was just a friendly neighbor looking around. I didn't respond and quickly shut the garage door. After checking, I found that nothing had been taken, though I did notice that a toolbox had been knocked over, which explained the crash I'd heard earlier. It seemed his clumsiness had given him away before he could steal anything. I called the police and reported the break-in. When they arrived, they examined the garage and noted that the man had pried open a small window to get inside. After taking my statement, they left to search for the suspect. A few days later, I heard about a man being caught in a nearby area for similar break-ins, though I'm not sure if it was the same person. This happened to my sister back when she was in high school, and since she's now about 39, it's been quite a while. She has always been an early riser, a habit that hasn't changed to this day. She used to wake up as early as 5 a.m., quietly go to the kitchen, make her own breakfast, and pack her lunch for school. My parents wouldn't wake up until around 7 a.m. to start their day with coffee and breakfast, and the rest of us were known for sleeping in. My sister never wanted to disturb anyone, so she handled everything herself, making sure she didn't ask for help. One particular morning, after finishing her breakfast and preparing her lunch, she sat by the side door of our house, waiting for the school bus. We hardly used the front door in the mornings, and from the side door, she had a clear view of the neighbor's house. At the time, that house had been empty for over a month, and there was an old, weathered wooden bench sitting outside, covered in dust. As she looked over, she noticed two women sitting on the bench, facing away from her, engaged in conversation. She could only see their backs and hear their soft voices mingling with the quiet sounds of the morning. She couldn't make out what the women were wearing, but their hair caught her attention. It was dark, of medium length, and appeared quite messy, like it hadn't been brushed in a long time. The conversation they were having sounded strange to her, as she couldn't recognize the language. It didn't resemble anything she had ever heard. What was more unsettling was that the women seemed to be arguing, their voices growing sharper and more intense, making my sister feel uneasy. Despite not believing in ghosts, my sister was curious, so she stayed there by the door, listening to their increasingly heated exchange. Then, it hit her, no one had lived next door for over a month. She thought perhaps these women were just random people hanging out at the empty house, but that didn't make much sense either, as the house was locked up and the property wasn't for sale. On impulse, she picked up a few small stones and tossed them toward the women to get their attention. As soon as she did, the women stopped talking, but they didn't move from the bench. After a few minutes, they began to slowly turn their heads toward her. My sister's heart started pounding, and she felt a growing sense of fear. Midway through turning, the women let out a soft, eerie chuckle that sent chills down her spine. She said she had never felt so scared in her life. Before they fully turned to face her, my sister bolted to my parents' room and woke up my dad. When my dad went outside to check, the women were nowhere to be found. They waited for a while, hoping to see them again, but the women never reappeared. My dad checked both the front and back of the house, but it was completely empty. He believed my sister's story, especially since the neighboring house had been vacant for so long. He wondered if maybe some restless spirits had decided to inhabit the abandoned house, which had fallen into disrepair with dusty windows and an overgrown yard. If the women had been real, they couldn't have gone far, and my dad also noted that they couldn't have entered the house since it was locked up tight. Years later, a nice family bought the house, tore down the old structure, and built a new one. But strangely, they moved out less than a month after moving in. We never found out why they left, but they always seemed a bit uneasy when we saw them. After they left, the house was neither put up for sale nor rented out again. I'm not sure where to start with this, but I'll do my best to explain what happened. It took place this morning, so it's still fresh in my mind. I woke up feeling a little off and have spent the whole day searching online for answers. I've checked different websites, read through forums, and watched some videos, but nothing has really helped. The more I search, the more I feel like I'm losing it. The only thing I found that was even close was a post from a few years ago, but it wasn't really related to what I'm going through. Anyway, I've always been a late sleeper, and since I work from home, I set my own schedule, so I stay up late and sleep in. This morning, I woke up closer to noon, and the house felt strangely quiet. I realized my family wasn't home, but at first, I didn't think much of it since by the time I wake up, my wife and kids are usually busy with their day. I'm used to them being out or doing things around the house. When I went to make a bagel, I noticed the back door was wide open. I thought maybe my wife had taken the kids outside to play, so I went to check. But when I looked, no one was in the yard or anywhere nearby. I muttered something about her leaving the door open, especially since we have a lot of bugs around here, and I closed it. As soon as I turned around, I saw that the front door was also wide open. Through the open door, I could see both of our cars still in the driveway, which struck me as odd. So, I stepped outside to see if my family was out front or talking with a neighbor, but no one was there either. I started to worry and think the worst. Across the street, I noticed that my neighbor's front door was also wide open. We're really close with them, our kids have grown up together, and the dad is a childhood friend of mine, so I figured maybe my family was over there. I walked over, knocked, and then called out as I stepped inside, but the house was completely empty. It was quiet, and there was no sign of anyone being there, even though all their cars were parked out front. By now, I was panicking. All these doors were wide open, yet no one was around. I rushed back across the street to grab my phone, thinking I'd call someone for help. That's when I saw that the house next door to mine also had its front door open. At this point, I felt like I was in some kind of horror movie. I looked down the street, and every single door I could see was open, but there wasn't a single person in sight. I ran back inside, went straight to my room to get my phone, which had been charging overnight. As soon as I unlocked it, I heard the front door open, and suddenly I could hear my wife and kids talking, their voices muffled. I rushed to the kitchen and found my wife carrying grocery bags. I was relieved to see her but totally confused. I asked her where she and the kids had been and how they had left without taking one of the cars. She looked at me like I was being ridiculous and said she had taken her car and had only been gone for about an hour. I told her about the open doors, the quiet neighborhood, and how I thought something was seriously wrong, but she just stared at me like I was overreacting. She even asked me if I was sure I wasn't dreaming. I was absolutely certain I hadn't imagined any of it. It was all so clear in my mind. She said she believed me and that we could look into it together, but I could tell she didn't really believe what I was saying. Later on, I talked to my friend across the street, and he told me that he and his family had been home all day. That completely threw me because when I had checked earlier, their house had been empty, there was no one there. I honestly don't know what to make of any of it. Even thinking about it now makes my heart race.